the reason 40-something% of Americans are obese is straightforward.
Tamar Haspel, author of Too Boldly Grow, food and nutrition columnist.
People are attached to the idea that the food they are eating is better than other food. It's super important to be accurate when you're talking about the differences among foods that may have other differences.
What have you experienced writing about beliefs and diet?
We are plunked down in a food environment that is deliberately...
Okay, my very first question, and this is an important one.
Okay.
So you raise chickens, you have your own eggs. If I were to blindfold you and I were to get your beautiful, organic, homegrown eggs, and I were to also give you eggs that were 7 cents from Walmart, the cheapest ones I could find, would you be able to tell the difference?
Well, I can tell you with some confidence that I couldn't, because I've done that test and I couldn't. And neither could anybody else. And of course, you kick this off with what is arguably the most incendiary piece I've ever written in my storied career, which is that all eggs basically taste the same. And, we started keeping chickens maybe 15 years ago. And I love having chickens. I love being able to walk out to the coop and get breakfast and bring it in. I love the idea that I know that the eggs that I am buying came from chickens that had good lives. But after we'd done that for a while, it occurred to me, they really just taste like eggs. I don't really think I can tell the difference. So I invite a few friends. Food people, actually. Some of them are food professionals, at least one chef, a restaurant owner. And we blindfolded people. This was not a dignified afternoon. We blindfolded people. We soft boiled eggs. We spoon fed them. At least 2 shirt fronts never recovered. And we asked everybody to try and pick out the evil eggs versus good eggs, what do they like? And nobody could tell the difference. And but what was funny was that I called a poultry scientist and I said, look, we did this test. Nobody can tell the difference. And she's like, oh yeah, we've known that forever. Nobody can tell the difference. People think that whatever eggs that they are in favor of taste better. And that can be just the color, white and brown. If you bring people into the lab and they know which eggs are white and which eggs are brown, they'll say that whichever ones they grew up with, the brown ones or the white ones, taste better. But of course your backyard eggs look different. They have stand-up yolks. They're usually more orangey. And, we corrected for that with a blindfold, but they have a more sophisticated way in the poultry industry, and they use lighting to disguise it. And as long as people don't know where eggs come from, they can't tell the difference.
So why do you think the piece was so incendiary?
Because people are attached to the idea that the food that they are eating is better than other food. And for lots of good reasons. I'm attached to my food and I think it's better than other food. And there's a good reason to go for eggs that come from backyard chickens or chickens that have been treated well. And now, unlike when I did this piece, there are some companies that are actually doing much better as far as chicken welfare. Mm-hmm. And we get attached to these ideas. But I think one of the important things that those of us who care about the food system should be thinking about is that, okay, yeah, I'm totally in favor of treating chickens better. I think it's actually a moral imperative. But if we tell people that those eggs taste better and then they taste them and they don't actually taste better, then it's like they just can dismiss us because we're blowing smoke. If we're wrong about that, what else are we wrong about? So I think it's super important to be accurate when you're talking about the differences among foods that may have other differences going for them, either as far as human health or environmental impact.
Yeah. Belief in food is very strong. And this is kind of leading me to a question about diet and belief. What have you experienced writing about beliefs in diet, and why do you think, whatever the number is now, 40 some odd % of Americans are obese?
Well, those are two very different questions. And let me take the second question first because it kind of feeds into the first question.
Right.
So I think that the reason 40-something% of Americans are obese is perfectly straightforward, which is that we are plunked down in a food environment that is deliberately set up to have us overeat. The foods are designed to be overeaten in that, I mean, companies do research on how to make them irresistible. They're designed to be convenient and in your face 24/7. And everywhere you look, there are foods that are specifically designed to swamp human willpower and tempt you into overeating. And as humans, we are organisms that are optimized for scarcity, as you well know. You have written about this in both of your books. And we don't have any upside protection. We have lots of downside protection if there's not enough food. But, our bodies take out all the stops so that we can try and find food. But if there's too much food, we don't have any protection because we never lived through a period where there was too much food. Too much food was never a threat to us until, last Thursday, evolutionarily speaking.
Right.
And so that is, I think, why we're fat. And, I've been fat and I think this is why I care about this issue so much, is that being fat, especially I was fat as a young woman, and being fat as a young woman sucks. It's terrible. It's the only thing that people see about you. And having gone out in the world as a fat woman and as a thin woman, the difference in the way you are treated is remarkable. And, any woman I've ever spoken to who has had that experience, shares my assessment on this. I think it's a little different for men, but men experience it too.
Yeah.
And so when you're fat or you're just a weight you don't want to be, you're desperate to find a solution. And that leaves the door open for all kinds of cranks, half-truths, bona fide science even, to sort of make a suggestion for here's a diet that can help. And, you asked me about diets in general, and now I'm talking about specific weight loss diets. But it's, weight loss and health are sort of intertwined here. Yeah. And one of the reasons I think that diets, including mostly their crank diets, get traction is because some people always succeed on them. And success isn't necessarily weight loss. It could be improvement in health, feeling more energetic, sleeping better, whatever it is. And that kind of evidence is super compelling. It's really compelling to the person experiencing it, but it's also compelling to the next guy who maybe wants to try it. Right. And so it's keep in mind, talking about evolution, our decision-making apparatus is optimized, not for papers on PubMed, but for the experiential, the personal, the tribal, the family. And so it's not surprising that kind of evidence and that kind of conversation is really compelling to us. And I think it leads some people down the garden path.
Yeah, I agree. And I would also argue that the papers on PubMed too around nutrition and weight loss, like that's
Don't
also
get me started, Michael.
Well, I'm getting you started. I'm doing it. I'm just hunking already. What's been your experience about writing about studies around weight loss and diet?
All right, here goes. So there is one thing to know about nutrition that's more important than anything else you can possibly know about nutrition. And it's something that it doesn't get appreciated, it doesn't get talked about, but it is the single most important thing to know if you're making a decision about what to eat. And that is that what we know about nutrition is absolutely dwarfed by what we don't know. And so if you are making a decision about diet based on this thing we know, without knowing all of this other stuff that may ameliorate it, it may exacerbate it, it may negate it, who knows what it does, then you're making a mistake. And, one of the classic examples, I think, is low carb diets, because the idea was that, okay, well, if, insulin is essential to fat storage. And so if you eat a diet that's so low in carbohydrates that you go into ketosis and you don't have these insulin spikes to shuttle glucose into fat storage, then you can't store fat. And then they do the experiment, and sure enough, your body finds ways to store fat in different ways. Yeah. And it's kind of like, it's the blind man and the elephant. Those guys have to carry a lot of metaphorical weight, Michael. People trot them out for all kinds of things, but I'll trot them out for this. So you got the guy who's got the leg, and he thinks an elephant looks like a tree. And the guy who's got the trunk thinks the elephant looks like a snake. And the guy who's got the ear thinks it looks like a manta ray. And the guy, and so every diet guru, every diet idea, there are a couple of exceptions, pretty much every diet idea is one of the blind men with the elephant. And, when you look at insulin spikes, oh, look, weight loss looks like no carbs. But guess what? Weight loss doesn't. And so everybody who's thinking about what to eat should go out into the world understanding that we don't really know. Yeah. That nutrition is hard to study, and that we should know what an optimal diet for humans is, but we don't. And we don't have the tools to find out either. Yeah. And we can get into that too. But so I think that's the single most important thing about diet and nutrition. If you go on PubMed and you see all these papers about diets, none of them acknowledge this. They just look at their they look at their toenail or their tongue or their tusk. And they say, oh, look at this. This is super important. And it could be important, but, we need the context to know that, and we don't have it.
Yeah. So what does this mean for the average person? Figuring out how to eat in our world that we've talked about with Doritos and Ho-Hos.
Great news for the average person. Mm-hmm. So humans are these incredibly adaptable omnivores, and we can thrive on basically any diet out there except the one we have. Mm-hmm. And what it means is you have so much latitude. And I will say that the best we can glean from what we know about food and human health is that you should eat a wide variety of whole-ish foods that you enjoy in quantities consistent with the weight you want to be. Mm-hmm. Because what that does is, instead of subscribing to an idea about what diet should be, it's a hedge against uncertainty. Okay, if we don't know what the optimal diet is, how do we proceed? Well, number one hedge is variety, because if we don't know what to eat, okay, you maximize your chances if you cover your bases. It's just like in your portfolio. Some things are going to go up, some things are going to come down. Mm-hmm. And the second great hedge is foods that have their nutrients intact, because we don't know, which ones are super important and which ones aren't, and how they work in combination. So a wide variety of whole-ish foods is your best bet. And I think everybody should enjoy their food. And being the weight you want to be is just a matter of calories in, calories out. Oh, that'll press people's buttons.
That's a whole new one.
That's a whole new one.
So there's kind of a push in the new administration around organic food. What is your sense of organic food and health? And then sort of the follow-up question is, what are potential upsides and downsides of organic food?
So I've been a fan of organic food for a long time, but probably for slightly different reasons than other people are. I'm fans of organic because I think it is a very realistic way for lots of farmers to make a living, because it's really hard to make a living as a farmer. I ran an oyster farm for 10 years. I know exactly how hard it is. And organic, the USDA organic certification gave farmers who had a certain worldview about using synthetic inputs find their customers who shared that worldview. And that meant that they can charge a premium. And so I think organic is great for that. It also facilitated, small local farms, which cannot feed the world, but are an excellent part of a community. It's a place where kids can go and meet a pig. It keeps money in local economies. It can become a community touchstone. So organic sort of facilitates all of that stuff. And I think it's terrific. And when farmers are making a comfortable living, then it gives them some latitude to do experimentation where people who have razor thin margins might not be able to experiment because sometimes experiments fail. And if there's no cushion, that becomes a very risky thing to do. Yeah. So all of those reasons, I am in favor of organic agriculture. Now, organic agriculture has one big downside, and that is that it does not yield as highly as conventional agriculture. And people say, no, look at this. The Rodale Institute did this study where corn found, the organic corn at Rodale exceeded the conventional corn in that area. And yeah, you can find producers who are really good at growing organic, whose yields are better than averages for conventional. But if you're going to compare the best organic, you have to compare it to the best conventional, and then you compare averages to averages, and there is at least a 20% yield gap. And if we're talking about agriculture's impact on our environment, a 20% yield penalty is a bad thing because it means you need 25% more land to grow the same amount of food. And land use changes are one of the biggest drivers of climate change. Now, human health.
Yes.
Organics are fine. They have fewer pesticide residues, but there's no evidence that difference has a meaningful difference as far as human health, because the pesticide residues from conventional agriculture, there's just no evidence that they're harmful. Pesticides are definitely toxic, and I worry about farm worker exposure, but I don't worry about residue exposure for consumers.
Yeah. Now we're going to pivot from organic to something totally not organic. Another one of your greatest hits. The diet soda. I love diet soda. I drink it every day. Am I doing a serious disservice to my health with my Diet Dr. Pepper habit?
You are totally fine.
Thank God. Thank God.
And this could be almost as incendiary as the idea that all eggs taste the same. Every time I write about this, I get, Tamar, it's an SNL reference. I don't think kids these days understand it. Tamar, you ignorant slut. Do you remember that from?
I remember that. Oh, I remember that. Yeah.
All right. You're showing your age.
Yeah.
And here's the thing about artificial sweeteners. People love to hate them for a variety of reasons. One reason is that there's this idea that everything in our food supply should be natural. And, my friend Alan Levinovitz, do you know him? He wrote a whole book about the naturalness philosophy, naturalness fallacy. And it's very interesting. And this actually goes back to the organic issue as well. People have this idea that naturalness is key when it comes to food. And in some ways it's not wrong. I mean, I just finished saying, what's the best way to eat? Well, it's a wide variety of whole-ish foods and not, highly processed things, because it takes the nutrients out. So it in some ways it's right. But the idea that natural things are safe and things that come out of a lab are unsafe is obviously not supportable. And so people think, for example, that stevia, the calorie-free sweetener or very low-calorie sweetener that's natural, is going to be safer than Splenda, but there's no evidence for that. And so one reason is that it's not natural. But then the other reason is that, and this burns me up. So there's a puritanical streak in the nutrition community. It's not just that you shouldn't eat too much sugar. It's almost that you shouldn't like sweet things. And the only acceptable, substitute for soda is like unsweetened iced tea or water. Yeah, go to
right.
town. But people like sweet things. And this idea that you can have your sweet thing with no downside flies in the face of this idea that, there's no such thing as a free lunch. You can't get
Right.
something for nothing. But in the case of artificial sweeteners, here's this technology that came along that actually enabled us to have sweet things without the consequences of the calories. And the nutrition community hates it. And I've written about this extensively. And it's funny, if you actually read the literature, if you go in and you read the papers, you can see the desire for artificial sweeteners to be bad just comes bubbling through the prose. And one paper that was written, I don't know, a few years back, it was a meta-analysis, and it concluded, no, there's no evidence that these things will do you any harm, but there's no evidence that doesn't mean they're safe, so make sure you don't eat them. It's like, it's crazy. And so diet soda's fine, have at it.
And a lot of the research that finds downsides, it's exceedingly high levels of artificial sweetener. Like, you would die from drinking that much liquid before you would die from that much artificial sweetener.
So ask yourself, why would an experimenter do an experiment with levels of artificial sweeteners 10,000, and there was one study recently that was literally 10,000 times what you would be likely to ingest in a day. Mm-hmm. Why would they do that except to show a problem?
Yeah. What do you think is our biggest health threat right now? Do you think it's just our food environment in general, or is it something not really? Yeah.
I do. I think it's just generally this food environment where, every time you go out of the house, you're confronted with this wide variety, something for everybody, of tempting, crappy foods. And, let's face it, most of us, most of the time, cooking is a chore. And it's the only chore that most people can afford to lay off on somebody else. Yeah. And so people do, because they don't want to do it. And I totally get that. I mean, I cook every day, but I have absolutely everything going for me. I have free time. I have flexible hours. I have a husband who participates. I can afford ingredients. I have decent skills. I have a beautiful kitchen. How lucky am I? And most people don't have all those ducks in that row. And if you don't, if you're working long hours, if you have to feed children who don't want a roast chicken, they want instant ramen, if you're trying to make ends meet and McDonald's is the only treat you can give your kids, it's like, I am extremely sympathetic to trying to navigate this food environment. I've created my own food environment bubble. It's the only way I can manage my weight. But that's not an option for a lot of people, for most people.
Yeah, absolutely. What are your thoughts on the role of exercise in health and weight control? So my sense is that with our food environment, the inherent problem is that we effectively get too big, and that has all these downstream problems that hurt our health. So if you can control weight, that's just going to reduce your risk of all these different diseases. Doesn't mean you're not going to get a disease, but it's essentially when you hit a certain weight threshold, you start to almost play with loaded dice. And so how does exercise modulate that, if anything, both weight and health?
Exercise, when I talked about nutrition, it's like the thing that we know, what we know about nutrition is dwarfed by what we don't know. But one thing I think we know, I would say with a very high degree of certainty, is that exercise is good for you. But the data on exercise and weight loss is actually, it's sort of interesting, because people have tried to do all kinds of trials to see if exercise can help people lose weight. And overwhelmingly, those trials come back negative, that exercise doesn't help people lose weight. And, you can theorize about why that is. And there's evidence for a bunch of the theories. There's evidence that when you exercise, then you just make up the calories because you eat more because you're hungry. There's also evidence, I'm sure you've read Herman Ponzer's book, Burn. There's evidence that if you exercise, especially if you exercise heavily and regularly, that your body compensates by using fewer calories to basically run your base metabolism. Mm-hmm. And so this is like the worst news ever, you know? Yeah. And so it seems to be difficult to lose weight via exercise. However, people who do lose weight report very consistently, and who are successful at keeping it off, consistently report regular exercise as a strategy to help keep that weight off. And that could very well be the case, or it could be that exercising regularly is a marker for being able to stick with a regimen. It's a marker for being, diligent or disciplined or responsible or whatever it is, and that can carry through with other things as well. But, I think it's a little bit mysterious to people still at this point.
Yeah, I agree. We were talking about corn earlier and organic versus conventional. There's a lot of claims that corn and soy subsidies and other subsidies were sort of implicated in making us as large as we are now. What's your sense on that? Another one of your greatest hits.
I know. Yeah, so you're delving into all the reasons I really don't have any friends. So let me ask you, do you know what year the United States had its highest, the greatest number of acres planted to corn?
No.
It was 1932. Oh, wow. And in 1932, we had about 113 million acres planted to corn. To put that in perspective, right now we have, I think it's 90 or 100 million acres planted to corn. So it's still a lot, but not as much as that peak in 1932. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's much higher yielding. We're growing way more corn on way fewer acres. But the point here is that corn has been the go-to crop in this country from the founding of this country. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that one of the reasons for that is that corn is this amazingly productive cereal grass. It is the most productive cereal grass on the planet, certainly that I know of. And I'll spare you the lecture on C3 versus C4 photosynthesis. I know people don't have the patience for that, but corn has this special mechanism that makes it an efficient photosynthesizer, which means that it's better at turning sunlight into carbohydrates. And so corn has always been great at this. And so when subsidies came along, of course, it makes sense to subsidize corn because that's what everybody was growing.
Right.
And, the flip side of this, the other crop that everyone complains about is soybeans. And if you look at the charts on soybean adoption in the United States, and it to a large extent, it started to replace oat acreage, especially as people didn't need horses anymore. And so soy replaced oats. And you can see that the subsidies followed the adoption of soy rather than led the adoption of soy. And so the reason that corn and soy are subsidized are because that's what people grow, not the other way around. And, there are mechanisms to keep it that way because the subsidies are based on the previous performance in particular crops in that county. But, and we talk about this, and people don't seem to realize that that the commodities that are subsidized in the commodity title in the Farm Bill, it's not just corn and soy. It's rye and oats and chickpeas and barley and dry beans and lentils. And all of those are subsidized in exactly the same way. So why do we have all of this corn and only this many lentils? Mm-hmm. Well, it's because corn is the most productive cereal grass, and you can grow the most calories per acre, and it's incredibly cheap to do. And so you end up with this product, corn, that then the food processors can turn into various ingredients, including high fructose corn syrup and dextrose and soy lecithin. That's from soy, not from corn, obviously. And and create that what we were talking about before, these diabolically tempting products that people can't resist. But it's not because of subsidies. It's because food companies are taking ingredients that are inherently cheap and relatively easy to grow and turning them into the foods that we have trouble saying no to. And the price differential is really small. You talk to economists, and most of them have said that, okay, maybe it's 10% of the price of the commodity. But corn and soy are globally traded commodities, and I'm married to a former commodity trader, and so we understand this in the pocketbook.
Yeah.
That there's so many moving parts in a global system that any price difference from subsidies is going to be really tough to pick out as a signal from all that other noise.
Yeah. Yeah. And so one of the big underlying things is, how the hell do you feed billions of people? You're going to need these crops that have, to your point where you said, it can produce a lot of calories per acre. And
right.
Corn does that spectacularly.
Yep.
Yeah.
And also potatoes do that. Sweet potatoes are good, not quite as good as potatoes. There are lots of nut and tree crops that are also very, very productive, that are excellent. And this sort of on the flip side, vegetables are kind of luxury products. We need a few servings to get some nutrients, but they use a lot of land. They use a lot of pesticides. They use a lot of fertilizer. They can't be grown, in no-till systems. And so, yeah, vegetables are great, but it's the staple crops that feed the world.
Yeah, that makes sense. So since we're talking about government stuff, one of the sort of big pushes of the new administration with RFK is removing artificial dyes from food. What is your sense on that sort of as a whole, and kind of a possible outcome of that?
Yeah, I think the evidence on food dyes is equivocal. But on the other hand, are they doing any good?
Yeah.
So if there's a possible downside and no particular upside, I think it's good to have less. It's not like, going after, say, preservatives, which actually do help improve our food supply by making food not spoil so quickly. And that decreases food waste. And so, but food dyes, are you going to die on the hill that Fruit Loops should be neon colored? I'm certainly not going to die on that hill.
Yeah.
But in some ways, going after food dyes seems like a waste of time, energy, and political capital, when I don't think they're a big part of the problem.
Yeah.
It's not something I can get exercised about, but I definitely think that, food dyes that might cause a problem, but don't do any good. Yeah, we can live without them.
Yeah. So it's one of those where don't necessarily need them. If we want to get rid of them, great. But if we spend a ton of time trying to get rid of them, the question becomes, could we have used that time going after something that really does seem clearly linked to some of our problems?
And also, if you make a big deal out of any one thing, then, people have an acute case of one thing-itis. They think that if you can just not eat this thing, you're going to be fine. And, look at low-carb diets. If you just don't eat carbohydrates, you're going to be fine. And if you make a big, hairy deal out of food dyes, and then you have parents focused on food dyes and believing, okay, as long as it doesn't, there's going to be boxes that say no artificial food dyes. Okay, that's great. It was like when high fructose corn syrup was the hate was all the rage. It was like 10 years ago. It had the high fructose corn syrup was really the thing to avoid.
Yeah.
And people avoid that. And to some extent, it was a marker for ultra processed foods, and that's really good. But then the companies just started using cane sugar, and things were a little bit more expensive and just as bad for you. Yeah. And so it's like focusing on one thing is almost always, it has these downstream effects because people want to think they're eating better, but still eat the things they like to eat. And this plays right into that.
Yeah, well, let's continue on the topic of one thing. What is your opinion on red meat? Oh, and also let me give some context. The first time I believe we ever chatted is because I was doing this big saturated fat story for Men's Health.
I remember.
Kind of with the underarching question being, should we eat red meat? Is it good or bad? How much should we eat? What's your opinion on that?
So I actually think red meat is probably fine. And it's nutritious in other ways. I think Americans eat way too much of it. But I think there are places in the world where they could really benefit by eating more of it. I do think that saturated fat, most saturated fat, including the saturated fat in red meat, for all you geeks out there, C14 and C18 saturated fats, which are the majority in our food supply. I do think that the evidence that they raise risk of heart disease is pretty compelling. In fact, I think it's about as compelling as nutritional evidence gets, because unlike other kinds of substances, it's really hard to test whole foods. So, you can give some people meat and some people not meat, but you can't blind them because they know they're eating meat or not meat. And it's hard to know, even if you get results from that, what are the differences between, is it the saturated fat? Is it something else in the meat? But saturated fat, you can give people saturated fat and you can give people unsaturated fat in a controlled trial and see what happens.
Yeah.
And I think that the evidence is as clear as it gets in nutrition that saturated fat raises LDL cholesterol. I think the evidence is also clear, and we know from a whole different body of research, that lowering LDL cholesterol decreases the risk of heart disease. I think those two things we know pretty well. And so I eat red meat, but I prefer lean red meat. That's why I spend all that time in a damn deer blind.
Yes. Getting nice, lean, super lean, skinny deer.
And instead of having the bejesus scared out of me by a black bear.
Yes, exactly. And not, what's your take on some of the plant-based meats that are trying to
I think they're
mimic
fine.
red meat? Yeah.
I think they're terrific. And actually one of the very few studies that does look at meat versus alternatives, Christopher Gardner did at Stanford, where he gave people 2 servings a day of either a burger or a plant-based burger. I believe it was Beyond Burger.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And of course, that's probably more meat and Beyond Burgers than anybody's ever going to eat. But he's trying to make a point. He's trying to suss out any differences. And yeah, it turns out that the people who ate the plant-based meats had, better biomarkers on cholesterol, and there were some other things too. And so, yeah. And of course, then the knock on them becomes, but they're ultra processed foods, which of course they are.
Yeah.
And then, okay, that we could have that conversation too.
That brings up a whole new can of worms.
Yeah, but I'm sure you have other things you might want to talk about.
Why do you love lentils so much?
Oh man, lentils. So lentils are like a perfect food. They are cheap, dirt cheap.
Right.
They're pretty versatile. They cook pretty quickly. They are nutritious. They are fiber rich. Lentils are awesome. And I'm going to make the case. So all of you, anybody who's listening out there, if you're a lentil hater, so let me make this one suggestion, that lentils and all beans are better with preserved pork products. So here is your opportunity to do some meat substitution. Instead of beef, go try some pork that has a little bit, it has a very different actually environmental impact. And if you make a little bit of sausage and you put it in your lentil soup or your white bean soup, it changes everything. And so if you're a lentil hater, and I hear from lentil haters all the time, try something with sausage and get back to me.
That just changes the game. Totally.
Changes the game.
All right, I'm going to do that. I like it.
Do you like lentils?
I do. Yeah,
No, that's a no. That's a no. Do you like lentils? Yeah. No.
Let's just say they're not a regular part of the rotation, but you have placed them in my rotation more, and now
Very
that
nice.
I know the pork trick, I think I'll be appearing more often.
Okay, so I have worked, I worked for a long time to develop the perfect Italian sausage spice mix. I'll send you an email.
Oh,
and
amazing.
you're going to take a pound
Amazing.
of ground pork, or do you have any game meat in your freezer?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so mix it 50-50 ground pork and elk or whatever it is you have, and put in my little spice mix, and you make a lentil soup with that, with a pound of sausage, a pound of lentils. It's like the pound cake of soup. Pound of sausage, pound of lentils, pound of carrots.
Amazing.
It's a beautiful thing.
Awesome. What's your opinion on Ozempic?
I love Ozempic.
Okay.
So
Tell us
here's
why.
the thing. These drugs are like, I think they're going to go down in history up there with, antibiotics and vaccines as far as the lives that they save. And they have been so effective in helping people lose weight. And I've talked to a bunch of people who've been on them, and they absolutely change lives. And this kind of goes back to what we talked about in the beginning. I've been fat, and I know that yeah, of course it can make you sick, it can make you dead. But long before it does that, it can make you just profoundly unhappy. And these drugs are giving people who've struggled with their weight, sometimes all their lives, finally a way to control this. And I have absolutely no patience with the people who say, but all you have to do is diet and exercise. But I think we have decades of experience showing that in this food environment that is deliberately stacked against you, people have a lot of trouble doing that. And these drugs help them do it because it quiets the food noise. And basically what it does is it enables a person to tackle this food environment of engineered irresistibility fortified with engineered resistance. And that's what these drugs give people.
Yeah. And I think your comment about turning down the food noise, we recently had a comment section on 2% where people were talking about Ozempic, and people who were using it weighed in, and that's the exact language they used. It was just, when I was just only doing diet and exercise, all I thought about all day was, how am I going to eat? What am I going to eat? When am I going to eat? And then they took Ozempic, and all of a sudden I stopped thinking about food all the time. It was just this, it was just this random thing in my life that wasn't a big deal. It's like, oh yeah, I have to brush my teeth. It didn't take all their mental energy.
It is crazy how it works, and the stories that I've heard from people who have been on it. And I just turned in my column for December about, my wish list for the new, the incoming administration's, 5 things they can do, and Ozempic for everybody. Ozempic for everybody.
That's great. And the other thing I'll add too is that one of the sort of criticisms that I've seen about Ozempic online is that you have to take it for life.
Yeah, you do.
But you have to diet and exercise for life too if you want to stay healthy. So it's like, well, the other option you're presenting us with, that's also a life deal too.
And if you can manage your weight without recourse to medications, that's terrific. I have been able to do it, but it's really hard for me. And as I said before, I have all of my ducks lined up to make it possible for me. But most people can't. Life intervenes. And to have a drug that can help, it is a complete game changer on obesity.
Yeah. Tell us about your book, To Boldly Grow, because I think what's amazing is that you grow a lot of your food, you raise a lot of your food. And what was that process like for you? Because you used to live in Manhattan and now you live on Cape Cod. What was that like, and what have you learned from that process?
It was crazy. So when we left Manhattan and we moved to Cape Cod, basically by accident, it's a long story. And we started to look around, my husband and I, for stuff we could do on Cape Cod that we couldn't do in Manhattan. And there's tons of stuff because, all right, when we were in Manhattan, we had whiskey barrels on the roof of our apartment building. Yeah. We were like the building weirdos, growing tomatoes on the roof.
I love it.
And so we started doing stuff. We started, okay, yeah, of course we did a garden, but then we got chickens, and chickens, as we know, are the gateway livestock. And then we ended up with turkeys and then pigs. And my husband knew how to fish, but we got a boat. I learned how to fish, hunting. The whole 9 yards. And, the project started to be about food, but it ended up being about something very different. And, you have written a lot about this in The Comfort Crisis and also in Scarcity Brain, that when you do something you've never done before, that's when you're on the steepest part of the learning curve, when you go from 0 to 1. The second time, when you go from 2 to 3, okay, then it flattens out a little. Mm-hmm. And when you do something that you've never done before, especially if it's something hard, you come out the other side feeling more competent, more confident. It's the secret to self-improvement is doing stuff that you've never done before. And, I have worked hard to be the best writer I can be. I've been a professional writer for, quarter century now. And I work at it. But if you ask me something I'm proud of, well, I can shoot, field dress, and break down a deer. Mm-hmm. And the reason that I'm proud of it is because it was way out of my comfort zone, and I did it anyway.
Mm-hmm. And you continue to do it.
I continue to do it.
On your property in New Hampshire.
Not this year,
Not this year, but in theory, in future seasons.
In theory, that's right. Yeah, let's talk next year at this time. Hopefully I'll have better news.
Given everything you know, and you've kind of touched on this, but I'd like to kind of hear how you answer this. How do you eat?
I eat well. And, my husband and I, we always say food is a morale issue. And we cook at home almost every day. We almost never eat out. Again, this is my way of controlling my own little food environment. Mm-hmm. And we eat everything. We eat meat and vegetables and lentils and whole grains and refined grains. I mean, who says no to pasta? And, so last night, for example, we had friends for dinner a while back, and I had made his favorite food was lamb. It was his birthday. So I made a leg of lamb for the birthday. Lamb is our indulgence. We're not big beef eaters, but we're fond of lamb. And to my chagrin, I overcooked it a little bit, so there was a thing of lamb meat in the freezer. Mm-hmm. And last night I made a ragu with it, with tomato and onion and celery and carrot, and I had some rosemary from the garden, and it was delicious. Nice. And so most of the time we sort of start by opening, okay, what do we have? What can we make out of this? But both my husband and I enjoy cooking. On a good day, we're pretty good at it, and we eat very bad. When people ask, "Oh, where's the best food on Cape Cod?" we always say, "Well, it's at our house."
Nice.
And so yeah, and we built a wood-fired oven.
Oh, really?
So and so we have pizza parties in the summer, and food is a huge part of our life.
Nice. What didn't I ask you? It'd be good to know.
Oh man, you did hit the greatest hits.
Yes.
Didn't you?
I tried.
So, you know what? I'm going to say nothing, and then as soon as we hang up, I'm going to think of the thing that you should.
That's how it goes.
I know. That's how it goes. So,
well, Tamar, thank you so much for joining us.
Michael, thank you for having me.